All right, so thank you so much. It is time now to look at what we have on our second talking point, and here we'll be looking at counterterrorism, the new agenda, and non-kinetic operation, and this will be done through the eyes of the country director, International Alert, based here in Nigeria, Paul Barishima. A very good morning to you. Okay,
good morning.
Let's just start by looking at what we have currently and how we are tackling. When I mean we are talking about Nigeria's military, especially in the war zone area, so to speak, and of course the non-kinetic, is it working?
Yeah, thanks very much. Just to add a brief note, there is Paul Nyolaku Bemshima. Just adding the other name to it. Yeah, so the question whether it's working, it's not an easy question to answer because there's quite a lot of efforts, counter-terrorism efforts that have been ongoing across the country. There are lots of military operations going on in conflict-affected contexts in the northeast, in the northwest, in the south-south, and in several parts of the country. There's quite a lot going on in terms of counter-terrorism operations. But what we really need to pay attention to is, are there other non-military, non-kinetic lines of effort that can complement what we are doing with kinetic operations? So with kinetic operations, you're simply using force, to restore stability or to restore security in a certain area. And this has to do with deployments, military deployments, to ensure that where violence is going on or where conflict is going on, like in the northwest, we're seeing banditry, upscale in banditry. If you go to the northeast, the insurgency happening there. In the north central, recently in the plateau, we saw ethnic, conflicts going on there. In the south-south, of course, we know what's going on with the unknown gunmen. And so in different parts, there are different levels of violence. And so based on the severity, the country deploys its military to restore stability and security in those areas. But of course, we are all familiar with that idea that the gun alone cannot restore peace in any area. The nozzle of the gun cannot do everything. And so are there other lines of effort that are non-cohesive, that we can deploy as well as the kinetic operations to make sure that we restore stability and peace in these areas? So it's one thing to mitigate violence, but it's also very important that we talk about peace. How can we consolidate on whatever gains we have achieved? For example, if military operations stop hostilities from going on, there is something that needs to be done after hostilities have stopped. There's a huge impact that the war has had in some of these areas. In the northwest, we're aware of all the IDP flows and even the refugee flows into Niger that is going on in the northwest. So many communities have been attacked. People have lost their farmlands. People have lost their assets. People have lost their lives. There is need for minimum guarantee of security. But on the back of that, what are some of these impacts and how can we deal with it, build back confidence among civilians, to continue their lives and so that development can begin?
Yeah, so it's good for development to actually begin because, like you said, many people have lost their belongings, their livelihood, source of living, but how can we give amnesty to people, that are neck deep into this? You are, of course, an expert when it comes to this issue. Is it something that can reduce the war? Is it something that can, because despite the fact that that door is still widely open, there are still pockets of attack. Why?
Yeah, so amnesty is just one of the options, for creating pathways and exits for groups that have been involved in violence. But I like to make it clear that amnesty should not be unconditional. Amnesty is just a pathway to ensure that we move out of violence, from violence to peace. And so we should always recognize that those who have violated international humanitarian law or law of armed conflict, these categories of people are not really eligible for amnesty because there's a different legal route for dealing with those kinds of people. So when we say amnesty, there is a certain categorization of crime.
Yeah, but we're already giving it out.
Yes, we are giving it out.
So how do we know those that are not entitled?
So there needs to be, we need to apply this with care. I know that there's been calls for amnesty in different quarters, but this doesn't need to be provided blanket. I know also in the Northwest, certain states have granted amnesty, but there needs to be careful assessment of what crimes these groups have committed that make them eligible for amnesty. In certain parts of the world, some countries have ignored, whatever crimes people have committed and prioritized reconciliation. That is a decision of the country to make. We all know what happened in post-genocide Rwanda. There was just a decision to forgive and to put forward reconciliation as a national approach to getting out of the issue. But that's genocide. When it comes to criminal attacks and violations of certain laws, both of the country and international laws, then there needs to be a careful analysis to know who is eligible for amnesty in the first place. I think that's the question that we haven't very well answered in all these offer of amnesty, that we have put forward in the country. In the Niger Delta, it happened. There are calls also in different quarters.
Yeah, but that of Niger Delta is different from the one in the Northeast.
Yeah.
Yeah, because those ones, they have specific demand, specific demand, so to speak. But here, it's not the same, it's different. You want to collect taxes, you want to govern the area, you understand? And you are, hitting everyone, military and non-military. But the guys up there, in the Niger Delta, they don't have issue with resident and indigenous so it's a different thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if you agree with me.
No, I totally agree with you. It's quite different. The ones in the Niger Delta, even though they had a face, and even though we understood what they were asking for, we understood their demands, it doesn't still remove the fact that some committed grievous crimes. So what we are talking about here is actually what crime people have committed. Whether they have a face or they are faceless, is the crime that they have committed that matters. I totally agree that the context in the Northeast is different. But as different as that context is, we need to understand that there are people who have been part of these groups who were forcefully conscripted. There are people who are part of these groups who played associated roles. There are people who are part of these groups who didn't join on their own accord. And so some of those categories of people, we refer to them as low-risk groups.
Yeah, but how do you identify them?
Yes, so you identify them through very technical processes. You need to profile them. You need to understand what roles they played in conflict. You need to talk to their community leaders. You need to engage very deeply. There are sets of instruments that are applied to understand what role people committed. A simple way to know is that when a military operation is going on, those who are really hardcore terrorists, for example, they really die hard sometimes. You would find that some of these associated groups are some of the first groups that surrender. And so we all know what international law says around people who surrender at the war front. They probably become prisoners of war, right? You shouldn't attack someone who surrenders at the front line. And so when that happens, there are detailed processes and questions that are being asked, to this category of people, to say what role did you play, and also an assessment is done that brings us to a place where we determine whether these were victims or these are hardcore perpetrators. Of course, the ones who are hardcore perpetrators should definitely go through the legal system. When they serve their term, then the country decides what to do in terms of reintegrating them. But the ones who are considered victims will then be eligible for rehabilitation and will be reintegrated back into society. But like I say, there are tools that are used very technical processes at different phases, and is currently going on. For example, in the Northeast, that's how you have certain caseloads going to what we refer to as clients, going to Operation Safe Corridor. So it's coming out of a careful process of determining who is eligible for rehabilitation, who is low risk, and who is high risk perpetrator that should then go through the judicial system. And I think these sort of tools are also useful, that for when we are considering to do something like that in the Northwest, it needs to go through a very detailed profiling procedure that determines who is low risk, who is a victim. I think that issue of victimhood hasn't quite landed, you know, even at the community level.
But you know, our time is flying fast. I just want to also get your opinion concerning the non-kinetic. You know, would you say it is working or not? If it's not, how do we strengthen it? How do we tighten it? What measures, other measures can we use? Because the non-kinetic has been here for a while now, and we still have pockets of attack. Yeah. So what's your assessment?
Yeah, so the non-kinetic is not a silver bullet, or nor is it a magic wand, but it's meant to complement the kinetic operations. And there are efforts.
So that means they should go hand in hand.
They need to go hand in hand. There are efforts of the military that are also non-kinetic. So, and that falls within the gamut of what the military does to strengthen cooperation with civilians, you know, civil military cooperation. And what that means is the military makes effort to understand what the needs of civilians are on the ground and see how they can provide some sort of succor and build a relationship. We have seen several cases where the military has offered medical assistance to different communities that have been conflict affected, trying to let them know what the mandate of the operation is, engaging with them, providing help, you know, providing even education. So all these fall within the non-kinetic efforts of the military. But there are also non-kinetic efforts of non-military actors, NGOs, CSOs, bilateral, multilateral partners, the United Nations. There are lots of support that they provide, both in the Northeast and in the Northwest, in terms of health, in terms of education for children, in terms of peace-building efforts, in terms of training, capacity building, you know, establishing dialogues and dealing with, you know, the sources of disputes and conflict in these different areas. All those put together are categorized as non-kinetic, you know, in very simple terms, non-cohesive. So it just means you are not applying force to deal with the problems. You are applying non-military, non-cohesive approaches in dealing with the issues. And much as the kinetic operations is important, there needs to be a framework that integrates the kinetic and the non-kinetic. I think that's the missing link at the moment. We need to have a framework that gives us a sense for when kinetic efforts you know, should be applied or should end, and when non-kinetic efforts should take over. And also, when should we even apply both at the same time? So in simple terms, if you recover a certain community or a certain territory, you know, what happens after clearance operations? Who should go in and take over? You know, providing security, providing services for civilians, and building that confidence, you know, for them to see that there's minimum guarantee of security for them to move on with their lives.
I must thank you for your time. Thank you so much. All right, viewers, the much we have on this discussion segment, we're sure to invite you again. I hope you oblige us.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so this is where we wrap up the discussion. And of course, we'll get to our colleague in Benin Network Center, where we'll say our goodbyes.